Wulawani, welcome. My name's Ian Campbell from Palliative Care Australia in Canberra on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. Welcome to Thursdays at 3, our regular series of conversations with people living and working at the end of life. Spiritual care is such an integral component of palliative care, which is perhaps unique in the field of medicine and healthcare. Today, ahead of her workshop this September at the Oceanic Palliative Care Conference in Sydney, we chat to the CEO of the Spiritual Health Association, Cheryl Holmes. G'day, Cheryl. How are you going?
Hi, Ian. Going very well, thank you. On the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations down here in Melbourne.
Melbourne. We're getting to know all the different nations around Australia, which is so good. Cheryl, there are perhaps some misconceptions and myths about spiritual care, and your workshop at OPCC is going to unpack a lot of that and look at the future of spiritual care. But let's get a head start on all that right now. And let's start at the start. What is spiritual care? What are we talking about, Cheryl?
Yeah, so I guess we have this, this understanding around people as spiritual beings, and the concept of we're familiar, especially in palliative care, with the concept of holistic care. And so we think about, we know about a person's physical well-being and their mental well-being, their social well-being, but we're not so clear often around spiritual well-being and spiritual health and those aspects of a person, especially if it's not necessarily to do with somebody having a particular religious or faith-based affiliation. So spiritual care is actually attending to that spiritual side of people, the ways in which we think about what gives our lives meaning. Where do we find a sense of purpose? Mm-hmm. Where do we experience that sense of transcendence? Or we might think about that as where do I feel a sense of being a part of something bigger than just myself? That sense of, also being more than just, I know I'm more than just my physical self. So spiritual care is all about the ways in which we attend to that inner life and that aspect of a person's being.
So clearly religion would be a part of that for some people, but listening to your explanation there, spiritual care is much more than religion.
Absolutely. And, we know from the latest census data that there is still a significant proportion of the Australian population who do affiliate with a religious tradition, and it's really important that our spiritual care practitioners are able to be attentive and aware of those worldviews and able to respond and be responsive to those worldviews. Bring in the people who are needed at those times. If someone wants to see their imam or the Catholic priest, we need to make sure that that aspect of care is available to people as part of meeting their spiritual needs. But we also know that there's lots of people, and a growing number of people, who are not, who wouldn't describe themselves as religious, but also lots of people who would describe themselves as spiritual but not religious.
Yeah.
And so people are finding all sorts of ways in which to explore that. I remember doing an education session for a group of training psychologists and counsellors. And we often think, like, one of the myths is that we think that Australians don't understand spirituality or are not interested. But in this class, I began by saying, when I say the word spirituality, what do you think of? Like, where does that take you? And one of the young guys said, I immediately think of when I'm out on my surfboard catching that amazing wave. So that's a sense of awe, and the sense of oneness with things beyond you. Like, it takes you out of yourself, that sense of oneness with things. So, yeah, I think we can think about spirituality in all sorts of ways.
What does spiritual health or spiritual care look like in the context of someone's palliative care journey? It sounds like lots of cups of coffee, lots of cups of tea in many respects, and some big conversations. But what does it look like in the context of someone's palliative care experience?
Yeah, I think the lots of cups of teas and lots of cups of coffees are often what happens. I think that's why we train volunteers a lot in the palliative care sector, because there is that need for space and the normal ordinariness of life and conversation. I guess one of the challenges for us has been thinking about spiritual care professionally. So what's the profession of spiritual care, and what are the skills and capabilities that someone who actually is trained and qualified as a spiritual care practitioner, what do they bring to the team? And I think, I was thinking a lot about this, just thinking about this conversation, and because somebody recently, a health minister said to me, I'm not quite sure why mental health practitioners can't just do this work. And I think one of the reasons why we actually really advocate for a qualified and credentialed spiritual care workforce is because when you go in and say to someone, I'm here as a spiritual care worker or spiritual care practitioner, it opens up the possibility of conversations and opportunities for conversations. It immediately takes people to a different level of conversation. And it, I think it also, it takes you into that space that's not necessarily about it's not just about my physical symptoms and my psychological symptoms. There is something around being able to be invited into those conversations around, I'm not quite sure what my life's meant. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen when I die. I'm not quite sure how to make amends for some of the stuff that I've done in life, and how to reconcile myself with some of the things. I'm not sure how to repair the relationships that have been damaged along the way. It's those sorts of conversations that I think spiritual care creates the safe space for.
They are some big conversations, and that is important work, and I can really appreciate the skill and the profession at play there. Is that what the future is about? Valuing spiritual health, spiritual care more, and investing in it? When we talk about exploring the future of spiritual care, is that the future? Better investment, better appreciation for it?
Oh, yes, please. Really want to see that. I think one of the really interesting things, like I've been the CEO of this organisation for just over 20 years now. So I've worked in the field for a long time, and what we see in the health sector, and we work across the health sector, so not just in palliative care but mental health, do a lot of work in public hospitals, and what we see is the inconsistency in the way spiritual care is provided across the sectors. And palliative care is an area, because spiritual care, as you said at the beginning, Ian, like palliative, spiritual care is integral to good palliative care, and it's been there in the foundations of palliative care and the hospice movement. That understanding of needing to integrate spiritual care and take people's spirituality seriously. But the conversation I had with the previous CEO of Palliative Care Australia was around, do you know how spiritual care is being provided across the palliative care sector? And how do we know how do you know what best practice is? Like, that's a lot of the work we do, and there's so much research around what good quality spiritual care looks like, and how are we measuring that? So I think what really disturbs me and has been the real driver for our organisation for a long time has been, how do we actually get that consistency in the way in which spiritual care is delivered across our health sector, including in palliative care? I think one of the things too in palliative care is that one of the measures is often, it often conflates psychological and spiritual. So when you're seeing, looking at whether people's needs have been met, it'll be psychological/spiritual.
Right.
And I think that conflation doesn't help us get really clear about what's psychological, what's spiritual. And of course there's overlaps, but it just, that conflation doesn't help us, I don't think.
What's the difference between the two in your mind? Is one more about the heart, one more about the head? How do you explain that divide between psychological and spiritual?
Yeah, look, I think like often when you think about what's going on psychologically for someone, it is around patterns of behaviour that have built up over time, misunderstandings about, so those patterns, experiences in life that have really impacted somebody and created certain messages about the way people think about themselves. I think that's where there's some overlap. But again, I think when we go to the spiritual elements, there really is that sense of meaning and purpose, but also what are the beliefs that I carry, and how have I formed my values? Can I actually articulate my values, and how do they inform the choices that I make in life? So yeah, that and look, I think it's really hard to tease those out at times.
Yep.
But I think that sense of people's beliefs and values, traditions, and that inner life around meaning and purpose and hope
is very much about the spiritual side of things.
Yeah.
Cheryl, as I say, some big conversations that spiritual health practitioners prompt with the people they work with. What sort of impact have you seen those conversations and that work have on people during your career? What sort of impact have you seen have on people as they face the end of their lives, and also perhaps their loved ones as well?
I think it's the permission giving that, as I said, that it gives to people. And also that sense of, I said about another realm. It's sort of like the spiritual care practitioner invites a different way of thinking into the room, or a permission to bring the spiritual side of ourselves, or to think outside of the physical world. There's a representativeness of the spiritual care person. I know, I began in my profession as a hospital chaplain, working as part of the palliative care team down at Frankston Hospital, with Molly Carlisle was the nurse unit manager at that time, who published a book called The Death Talker. So she's done a lot of work around in the area. And I just, there are so many conversations that stay with me and so many experiences. But it is that breaking open, like it's the breaking open of conversations that can be difficult, one, for the person to have with family. Providing that sort of space for people to have the conversations. Often there can be, I've noticed for people who do have a religious background, that when there are it's a time when questions and doubts can arise, and a sense of guilt about having doubts and questions arise.
Yeah.
So having safe spaces to have those conversations is really important for people, and the repairing of relationships. So
Yes, I know. Yeah.
giving family permission to have those conversations with their significant other.
What a gift to be able to repair relationships at that final point. Such a gift to families and people who are dying, to be able to repair relationships.
Well, and what a pity that we leave it till that moment to have those conversations. And I guess that's that is also the work of spiritual care, is to be opening that up for people all the time, no matter where they are on their health journey. But there's some things that you would regret if it came to this time. Why?
Let's zero in on that point a bit more, Cheryl, about let's not wait until we're dying to tackle this big stuff. That spiritual care, spiritual health should be part of our everyday when we're healthy as well as when we're sick. How do we go about doing that?
I think one of the things about end of life is that it's a time when you become really real. Like, it strips down the walls and the barriers that we're building up all the time. We protect ourselves all the time, and we need to at certain times. And being vulnerable is not something that comes easily. Like, talking about real stuff doesn't come too easily. We're used to the conversations that stay on a certain level,
in a safe space.
In a safe space around, the weather and football, and if you're down in Melbourne, that is. We stay with the safe conversations, and sometimes I think it's because we don't trust that other people maybe have the same sorts of questions, the same sorts of wonders about life and relationships, the same struggles. And so I think it is about taking risks with each other. It's the taking risks to, if I can be just that little bit more vulnerable with you about what's really going on in my life, then maybe you might risk being a little bit more vulnerable with me, and having some of those hard conversations. And that's not easy. I think when there have been damaged relationships, actually fronting up to somebody to say, this happened between us. Can we talk about it? I really don't want to carry this forward.
I hope you don't mind me asking, Cheryl, but how good are you at that? Or are you a bit like a carpenter with the house extension that's never finished?
That's a great analogy. Look, as I said, I think we're all works in progress as far as that goes, and I like to think that that I have a group of people with whom I do have those conversations. Again, it is about the safe spaces, because some stuff, we all carry stuff that's pretty raw. I think it's one of the lovely things about the work in spiritual care is that it does challenge you consistently to ask the question of yourself around how authentic am I being? Am I standing in a place of integrity? And And sometimes that's easier than other times.
Where does your passion for this work come from, Cheryl? As you say, you've been CEO of Spiritual Health Association since 2002. What gets you out of bed? Where does your passion come from for this?
When I first began working, it was as a speech pathologist, and so I've always worked in healthcare, and I worked in a large aged care facility. I found, as a speech pathologist, that there were people I was working with who were long-term rehab patients, who once they'd got to the end of their speech journey, needed to be crossed off my list because there were other people needing to come on, and it was the recognition that there was a real lack of holistic care. So often I would be the only one who would be having extended conversations with people about what was going on for them. And once I stopped doing that, that ended. And it became really important to me to see that holistic care. I guess, I grew up in a church base, so and at one stage was ordained as an Anglican. So the spiritual side of things had been a part of my life as in that faith context.
Yeah.
Left that through the spiritual care journey, because I think when you get opened to the ways, the multitude of ways that people do find meaning, and the multitude of ways that people make sense of life and connect, for me, that just created a whole range of pathways and just expanded my worldview. And you'd never forget some of the stories you never forget the experience of working with some of the people as a spiritual care practitioner, and seeing the difference that it can make for people to have a spiritual care practitioner there at some of those most vulnerable, raw, traumatic times in someone's life. And so, I worked for 5 years, and I was a young mother at the time. So I was in my early 30s at the time, and accompanied a number of women a similar age to myself at the end of life. And also a number of children similar to my children's age. That became not sustainable for me. And then I became passionate about how do we create a sustainable workforce. And that's not just spiritual care practitioners, that's the whole workforce, because we need those ways of knowing what it is that supports and sustains and resources us in order to keep turning up. So that's part of what drives me all the time. That's where my passion comes. It makes a difference for people. I've seen that, and I think everyone has the right to have access to really good spiritual care, and the workforce needs to be sustained, and we can't ignore the spirituality side of that.
Cheryl, such a great taster for the conversation you'll be leading this September in Sydney at the Oceanic Palliative Care Conference. Who should come to your workshop? Who do you want to see there?
Oh, everyone. And I recognise there's going to be a lot of people. Look, I think people who truly want to see models of palliative care that care holistically for people who are interested in that. We've just co-designed a national model for spiritual care for the health sector, and we're about to trial that in 11 sites, both here in Victoria, but more broadly. And so I think people who are really keen to see models of care, who are really passionate about quality and safety of spiritual care, so health professionals, and it would be great. I don't know, are there any politicians coming who, like, where are the investors?
We're trying to get some money in the room. Absolutely, Cheryl. But it sounds like a really ideal time to connect with you and the Spiritual Health Association, given the trials that you point to, given the work that you're putting into those models of care. It sounds like the perfect time to connect with you at OPCC. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your work with us today, Cheryl, and we'll see you at OPCC in September. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Ian.
Cheryl Holmes, the CEO of the Spiritual Health Association, and you'll learn more from Cheryl this September at the Oceanic Palliative Care Conference in Sydney. Registrations are now open, and you'll find a link in the show notes. Palliative Care Australia and the Spiritual Health Association have also collaborated on some great online training in spiritual care. It's free and it's available now, and I'll include a link in the show notes so you can explore that further as well. Thanks so much for tuning in to Thursdays at 3, whether that's via PCA socials or Spotify, and engaging in matters of life and death. You'll find advice, tools and support at the Palliative Care Australia website, where you can also make a donation to support our work. See you next Thursday.